Julian Croft moved through the gilded ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, like a shark navigating a coral reef. He was in his element, yet utterly alien to it. The air, thick with the cloying scent of hothouse lilies and a fog of competing perfumes, was a symphony of manufactured pleasantries and veiled transactions. He smiled, a precise muscular arrangement that did not reach his eyes. He nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, not agreement. He shook hands with men who feared his market influence and women who desired his name, the Croft name, on their charity committee letterheads as if it were a rare jewel. At 62, Julian had cultivated a presence that was less a personality and more a gravitational force. He had built Croft Legacy Holdings from the grit, rust, and scrap of the Baltimore shipyards, from a single leveraged tugboat into a global logistics leviathan that could choke continents by redirecting its fleet. He understood supply chains, leverage, and the intricate, often brutal mathematics of power. What he had begun to suspect he did not understand, however, was the delicate, venomous ecosystem of his own home. He passed a towering sculpture by a contemporary artist he privately considered a charlatan, its polished steel surfaces reflecting the distorted, smiling faces of the city's elite. The price tag for this gala, a single evening of performative philanthropy, could have funded a dozen startups in the gritty neighborhoods where he'd begun his ascent. He felt a familiar, low-grade contempt. These people didn't build things. They curated them. They traded on names, not on tonnage shipped or deadlines met. They were the decorative barnacles on the hull of the world he moved. He saw his daughter, Isabel, posing for a photographer near the entrance to the Temple of Dender, her back artfully arched in a gown that cost more than a longshoreman's yearly salary. She caught his eye and offered a small, cool wave, a gesture meant more for the camera than for him, before turning back to her audience, her face a mask of practiced ennui. She spoke often and loudly about the evils of global capitalism, a sermon she delivered from a series of five-star resorts and private jets, all funded by the engine she so publicly disdained. The hypocrisy no longer stung. It was simply a data point in his assessment of her character. He spotted his wife, Eleanor, across the room, a shimmering mirage of emerald silk and diamonds. She was laughing with Marcus Thorne, their family accountant, and for all intents and purposes, the chief financial officer of their private lives. It was a perfect tableau, a piece of living art for the society pages. The elegant, cultured wife, and the handsome, attentive professional. Marcus was everything Julian was not. Smooth where Julian was abrasive, charming where Julian was commanding, pliant where Julian was immutable. He was a creature of this world, born into a languid wealth that Julian had been forced to conquer. He was fluent in its nuanced language of flattery and insinuation. Julian had always found him obsequious, a well-tailored lapdog content to fetch financial reports and offer fawning advice. But lately, the way Eleanor looked at Marcus, the way her laughter seemed just a little too genuine, a little too unguarded, had begun to set off silent alarms in the cold, analytical part of his brain that had made him his fortune. It was a deviation in the data, a subtle anomaly that hinted at a systemic failure. The angle of her head, the frequency of her touch on his arm, the shared glance that lasted a fraction of a second too long, these were metrics, and they were trending in the wrong direction. He needed a moment of silence, a commodity more precious than any on the stock exchange. Excusing himself from a droning senator discussing infrastructure subsidies, a conversation Julian could have led with his eyes closed, he slipped away from the main throng. The press of bodies, the heat, the wall of noise. It felt like a physical pressure, and cloying miasma of triviality. He made his way toward the less crowded Egyptian wing, the shift in atmosphere immediate and welcome. The air here was cooler, drier, tasting of dust and millennia. He found a quiet alcove, Behind the massive granite sarcophagus of a long-dead pharaoh, the cool stone a welcome reprieve against his back. The hieroglyphs etched into the surface told a story of power, death, and the desperate hope for an afterlife. Julian ran a hand over the cold carved stone. He understood power and death. The afterlife, he had always assumed, was simply the balance sheet you left behind. From this shadowed vantage point, he could still see the main hall, a glittering, distant panorama of the life he had paid for. Every gown, every glass of champagne, every smile a transaction on his personal ledger. And then he saw them, Eleanor and Marcus, breaking away from the crowd, slipping into the same corridor. Their movements synchronized, furtive. They thought themselves unseen. They stopped near a climate-controlled display of canopic jars, their bodies angled toward each other in a conspiracy of intimacy that was more damning than a public embrace. Julian remained perfectly still, a predator frozen in the shadows, his breathing controlled, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. The ambient noise of the gala, the distant orchestra, the murmur of 1,000 conversations provided acoustic cover, but his ears were trained to pick out the signal from the noise, the whisper of treason in a room full of chatter. "He's watching us," Eleanor murmured, her voice a low thrum of pure irritation, the sound of a prisoner discussing a warden. She didn't look around. She didn't have to. It was a statement of fact. I can feel his eyes on my back, the old sentinel on his castle walls. Let him watch. Marcus's voice was as smooth as single malt scotch, but laced with something harder, an undercurrent of steel Julian had never detected before. It's the last gala he'll ever attend as master of this universe. The foundation is laid, darling. Every wire, every support. We're just waiting for the keystone to fall. Are you certain it will work? Eleanor's hand, laden with a diamond Julian had given her for their 20th anniversary, the Star of Geneva, the press had called it, briefly, nervously, touched the sleeve of Marcus's tuxedo. The financials. It's so complex, a web of his own making. That's the beauty of it, Eleanor. Its complexity is its weakness. He built a fortress with 1,000 doors, and he gave me all the keys. The Phoenix Protocol is my Sistine Chapel. It's not a blunt instrument. It's a symphony of digital decay. When the time comes, I won't just steal from Croft Legacy Holdings. I will use its own systems to make it evaporate. A cascade of untraceable liquidations, assets converted to cryptocurrency, routed through a dozen ghost corporations in jurisdictions that barely exist. By the time any forensic auditor untangles the first knot, we'll be watching the sunset from a terrace in a country that considers an extradition treaty a breach of etiquette. Just be patient. Play the part of the devoted wife for a little while longer. I'm tired of the part, she whispered, a sudden shocking venom in her tone that Julian had never heard before. It was the voice of a stranger, tired of being a decoration, a beautiful, expensive object he acquired to complete a collection. I want to live, not just exist in his shadow, waiting for the crumbs of his attention. Marcus leaned in, his lips almost touching her ear. His words a poison dart. Soon, the doctor is on board. He understands the necessity of the narrative. It just needs to be sudden, believable. A man of his age, his temperament, the stress of his empire, a massive stroke, a sudden coronary. Nobody will question it. Then you'll be the grieving widow, inheriting a hollowed-out empire, and I'll be the supportive friend of the family helping you pick up the pieces. A tragedy. He chuckled, a low predatory sound that vibrated with triumphant cruelty. It's almost poetic. He spends his life building an empire of logistics, and in the end, he's nothing but a logistical problem to be solved. A block of cryogenic ice formed in Julian Croft's chest, freezing the air in his lungs. The Phoenix Protocol. The doctor, a tragedy. It wasn't just an affair, a simple, sordid betrayal. It wasn't just greed. It was a coup, a meticulously planned execution, not just of his body, but of his entire life's work, his very name, orchestrated by his wife and the man he trusted with the keys to his kingdom. The keystone. He was the keystone. Remove him, and the entire arch of his life would collapse into dust. He thought of their wedding day, of Eleanor's vows, of the children they had raised. He tried to summon a feeling of heartbreak, of personal loss. But he couldn't. The emotional circuits were overloaded, bypassed by a cold surge of pure analytical fury. This wasn't a marital issue. This was a hostile takeover. He didn't move as they separated, melting back into the glittering crowd with practiced ease. Eleanor's expression once again a mask of serene elegance. The sounds of the party returned, but they were different now, distorted and macabre. The laughter of the guests sounded like shrieks, the clinking of champagne glasses like the breaking of bones. He was no longer a shark in the reef. He was the whale, already harpooned, bleeding out in a sea of smiling, oblivious faces. The pain was not emotional, not in a way he could recognize. It was strategic, a deep cellular shock. He had been outmaneuvered. He, Julian Croft, the master of the game, who could predict currency fluctuations and commodity shortages months in advance, had been made a fool in his own home. The rage, when it came, was not hot. It was cryogenic. It froze the shock and the hurt into a diamond-hard point of absolute clarity. They wanted a tragedy. They wanted him to fall. They had written a play and cast him as the victim. Fine. He would give them exactly what they wanted. He would let their tragedy unfold, but he would be the one writing the final bloody act. He walked out of the museum without a word to anyone, leaving Eleanor to field the questions, to perform the role of the slightly concerned wife. The ride home in the back of his Maybach, usually a sanctuary for thought, was a cocoon of seething silence. The leather smelled of deceit. The quiet hum of the engine sounded like a countdown. He didn't look at the glittering Manhattan skyline, a skyline he had helped build, dotted with towers his cranes had erected and filled with goods his ships had delivered. He was already somewhere else, his mind a whirlwind of calculations, his brain rewiring itself for a new kind of war, the Phoenix Protocol, a name full of breathtaking arrogance. Marcus saw himself rising from the ashes of Julian's life. Julian would ensure all he found was scorched earth. The first call he made was not to a detective or a security consultant. It was to David Chen, his lawyer for 30 years, the only man alive who knew where every corporate body was buried because he had helped Julian dig the graves. "David," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a dead calm on the surface of a boiling sea. "Clear your schedule for tomorrow morning, all of it. We need to plan a funeral." There was a pause on the other end of the secure line. David's mind would be racing. "Julian, are you all right?" "Whose funeral?" "Mine," Julian said, and hung up the phone, the click echoing the closing of a chapter and the cocking of a hammer. The next morning, in David Chen's soundproofed office overlooking the gray expanse of the harbor, Julian laid out the conversation he had overheard. He omitted no detail, his voice the dispassionate monotone of a man dictating a postmortem damage report. He recounted the words, the tone, the casual cruelty. David, a shrewd, meticulously dressed man with the weary eyes of a confessor who had heard every sin, listened without interruption, his hands steepled under his chin. He had been with Julian since the beginning, since the days of rusted barges and fistfights on the docks. He understood the man Julian was, and the man he had become. When Julian finished, the silence in the room was absolute. David took a slow breath, removed his glasses, and polished them with a silk cloth. A private investigator could confirm the affair in 48 hours. We can start divorce proceedings quietly, file an injunction to freeze their personal assets. We can initiate a deep forensic audit of the family office financials. No, Julian cut him off, his voice like grinding stone. An audit sends him to ground. He'll bolt, trigger what he can, and disappear. A divorce lets Eleanor walk away with a fortune, per the prenup. That's not justice. That's a severance package for a job well done. He leaned forward, his eyes like chips of flint. They want me gone. They have a plan, a Sistine Chapel of a plan. So I'm going to let their plan succeed. I want to see it. I want to watch them dance on my grave, David. I need to know the full scope of the betrayal. Every last dollar, every last lie. And I need to record it, document it, so that it becomes their legacy, not mine. David's professional composure finally cracked. He stared at his oldest friend, seeing a man who had been hollowed out and refilled with something cold, ancient, and dangerous. Julian, this is insane. Faking your own death? The legal exposure, the logistical risks. It's astronomical. We'd be committing a dozen felonies ourselves. Conspiracy, fraud, filing a false report. I could be disbarred. You could go to prison. The rewards are total victory, Julian countered, a flicker of dark fire in his eyes. They think they're writing the story. I'm going to give them the pen, the ink, the finest paper. I'm going to let them write it all down, and then I'm going to burn the book with them inside it. You're a lawyer, David. Think of it as the ultimate deposition. Unfiltered, honest testimony, given when the subjects believe there are no consequences. As for the law, we operate above the law every day in a dozen countries. This is just bringing that philosophy home. The sheer magnificent audacity of it began to appeal to David's strategic mind. It was a legal problem of unprecedented, terrifying complexity, a puzzle worthy of his skills. Where would you go? How could you disappear? You're one of the most recognizable men in the country. You'd be a ghost. I already own a tomb, Julian said, with a grim smile. He began to explain the facility. A ghost on his own books. Officially, it was CLHDR-04, a disaster recovery data center for a minor subsidiary, housed in a nondescript brutalist building in an industrial park in Queens. The top floor, however, was accessible only by a biometric freight elevator that bypassed the main building systems. It was a state-of-the-art command bunker, a ghost asset he'd built during a hostile takeover scare a decade prior. It had its own generator, its own water and air filtration, a dedicated satellite uplink, and was electronically shielded to defeat any form of surveillance. It's soundproof, secure, and invisible. I'll call it the observatory. The doctor, David said, his mind catching up, ticking through the variables. They mentioned a doctor. That's the linchpin. How do you control a doctor? I know who it is. Julian's voice was grim, devoid of any warmth. Alastair Finch, a cardiologist with a Park Avenue practice. 10 years ago, his practice was about to go under. Bad investments in a biotech scam, a gambling problem he thought he could hide. He was days from ruin. I bailed him out, anonymously, through a series of cutouts, but I kept the receipts. He owes me more than his career, David. He owes me his entire life. He'll do what I say. That afternoon, Julian met Dr. Finch in a private dining room at a quiet, old-world club where discretion was the main item on the menu. Finch, a man who had grown soft and complacent on his restored success, radiating an aura of self-satisfied importance, walked in smiling. The smile vanished the moment he saw Julian's face. Julian didn't offer a greeting. He simply slid a thin leather folder across the polished mahogany table. Finch opened it. Inside were copies of the cashier's checks, the untraceable wire transfers, the promissory note signed with a desperate hand, and surveillance photos of him meeting with a known bookie. The complete anatomy of a life saved from the gutter. "You have a choice, Alistair," Julian said softly, his voice a silken threat. "You can participate in a controlled, theatrical event of my design. You will be well compensated for your performance. Or you can participate in the complete and utter destruction of your reputation, your license, and your freedom. Because I know about your conversations with Marcus Thorne. I know about the narrative you've agreed to help create." The doctor began to tremble, his face turning the color of spoiled milk. "Mr. Croft, they pressured me. Marcus has certain information about a malpractice suit. He made it go away." "Save it," Julian snapped, the sound like a whip crack in the quiet room. "Your weakness is of no interest to me. My instructions are, you will receive a call. You will proceed to my home. You will pronounce me dead from a massive, unexpected coronary thrombosis. It has to be clean, sudden, and medically undeniable. You will sign the death certificate, and you will ensure my body is taken to a private crematorium of my lawyer's choosing, citing concerns for family privacy. Do you understand?" Finch, trapped, terrified, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by two different masters, could only nod, sweat beading on his upper lip and dripping onto the damaged tablecloth. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making. The final piece was surveillance. This was not a job for a standard security firm. David Chen, through a contact in Tel Aviv, hired a team of ex-Mossad technicians, specialists in corporate and political espionage, who operated in a world of legal gray, under the guise of a comprehensive security system upgrade, a reaction, Eleanor was told, to a recent spate of high-profile burglaries. The two-man team spent a full day at the Croft Mansion. They were ghosts, quiet, efficient, and invisible. They installed microscopic, broadcast-quality cameras in every key room: the grand drawing room, the formal dining room, the kitchen, Julian's study, the master bedroom, even the hallways outside the rooms of his children, Thomas and Isabel. The listening devices were state-of-the-art, sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from across a room and filter out ambient noise. The entire system fed into a heavily encrypted closed-loop network, accessible only from the observatory. The night before his scheduled death, Julian walked through the cavernous house. It was no longer a home. It was a theater, a stage set for a macabre play in which he was the ghost, the audience, and the director. He stood in the doorway of his son Thomas's room. Thomas, 25, had all of Julian's ambition and none of his discipline, a volatile combination that had resulted in a string of spectacularly failed startups, each one funded by the Croft Bank. He saw Isabel's room, a temple of white linen and minimalist aesthetics. At 22, she was an art history major turned lifestyle influencer, a young woman who curated a life of effortless luxury on Instagram, funded by a man whose work she openly disdained as vulgar, planet-killing commercialism. They were not his children in any meaningful sense. They were his dependents, parasites clinging to the hull of the great ship he had built. The realization landed with the quiet, final thud of a coffin lid closing. He felt nothing. The part of him that could feel that kind of paternal pain had been cauterized in the cold stone alcove of the museum. The next afternoon, Julian was in his study, going over quarterly reports for a shipping lane in the South China Sea. He glanced at his watch. 2:58 p.m., showtime. He took a deep, steadying breath, the calm of a soldier before battle. At precisely 3:00 p.m., he pressed the discreet button on the side of his timepiece, a custom Patek Philippe. The button sent a silent, encrypted alert to David, Dr. Finch, and the private ambulance crew, all waiting on standby. He stood up, loosened his tie, and with a sense of profound and chilling purpose, swept a heavy stack of files from his desk. The crash of paper and binders was the opening chord. He let out a sharp, practiced gasp, clutched his chest, the adrenaline of the act creating a genuine dizzying spike in his heart rate. He allowed his knees to buckle and crash to the floor, turning his body at the last second so that his head hit the thick Albasan rug with a convincing, sickening thud. He forced his eyes into a fixed, unfocused stare at the ornate plasterwork on the ceiling, a pattern he had chosen 20 years ago and had not truly seen since. He heard the housekeeper's scream first, a piercing shriek of genuine panic and fear. A good woman. He'd make sure David took care of her. Then footsteps, running, the click of heels on marble. Eleanor. Julian. Oh my God. Julian. Her voice was high-pitched, a carefully modulated shriek, but beneath it, he could now clearly discern the note of theatricality. It was a performance. A damn good one, he had to admit. He felt her hands on his face, her touch surprisingly cold, clinical. Wake up, Julian. Someone call 911. The next sequence of events unfolded as a series of sounds and sensations filtered through the fog of his feigned unconsciousness. His son, Thomas, thundering down the stairs. Dad! What the hell happened? The voice held annoyance more than concern, the irritation of an interrupted afternoon. Isabel, wailing, a sound so over the top, so perfectly calibrated for dramatic effect, it was almost comical. The private ambulance service, arranged by David, arrived with impressive siren-free speed. Then Dr. Finch, who took control of the room with practiced authority, his voice a bomb of professional calm. Please, give me some space. He felt the cold disk of a stethoscope on his chest, a penlight shining into his unblinking eyes. The world was a blur of muffled voices and urgent, yet controlled movement. Finch was a good actor, too. I'm sorry, Eleanor. Finch's voice was grave, a masterful performance of sorrow and finality. He's gone. It looks like a massive coronary thrombosis. There was nothing anyone could have done. It would have been instantaneous. He wouldn't have felt a thing. The silence that followed was deafening. There was no heartbroken sob from his wife, just a sharp, controlled intake of breath, the sound of a person processing a successful, high-stakes transaction. The harsh rasp of the body bag's zipper was the most surreal sound he had ever heard. He was enclosed in vinyl darkness, the scent of his own cologne cloying and strange. He focused on his breathing, keeping it shallow, impossibly slow, a yogic trick he'd learned long ago to manage stress. He was lifted, carried, the motion swaying and unnatural. He was loaded into the back of the ambulance. The doors closed with a solid, definitive slam, and the vehicle pulled away from the house, leaving his old life, his old self, behind in the dust. A few blocks later, the van pulled over into a quiet, tree-lined side street. The zipper came down. Dr. Finch was looking down at him, his face ashen, his hands trembling. It's done, he whispered, his voice cracking. They believed it completely. Eleanor. She didn't even cry. Julian sat up, the cool air hitting his face. He felt nothing. He was no longer Julian Croft, titan of industry. He was a ghost, a phantom with a purpose. The ambulance drove not to a hospital morgue, but to the anonymous industrial park in Queens. A subterranean garage door rolled open to admit them and shut just as quickly, sealing them inside a concrete box. The freight elevator, activated by David Chen's thumbprint and a numerical code Julian had memorized, took them to the top floor in silent hydraulic comfort. The observatory was exactly as he had left it years ago, cold, sterile, and brutally efficient. A wall of high-definition monitors dominated the space, currently dark. A bank of servers hummed quietly. David was waiting for him, his expression a mixture of profound awe and deep paternal concern. "Welcome to the afterlife, Julian," David said quietly, his voice dry. He hit a series of keys on a terminal, and the wall of monitors blinked to life, a dozen silent, godlike windows into the home Julian had just departed. The audio was so crisp he could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound he hadn't consciously noticed in years. "They're in the drawing room." David pointed to the largest screen. Julian looked. His breath caught. Eleanor was on the sofa, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, a study in elegant sorrow. Thomas was pacing, already on his phone, his back to his mother. Isabel was curled in an armchair, her face illuminated by the glow of her own phone, her thumb scrolling rapidly. There were no tears. There was no shock. There was only a tense, vibrating silence, the quiet of actors waiting for the director to yell, "Cut," so they could finally have a drink. "The funeral is in 3 days, as per your instructions to me, in the event of your untimely demise," David informed him, using the legalistic phrasing of the contingency plan they had drafted. "The reading of the will is scheduled for 1 week after that. We're recording everything. Every camera, every microphone is feeding into a secure, redundant server array. Terabytes of it." Julian nodded, his eyes locked on the screens. He felt a strange detachment, the clinical interest of a scientist watching a new, fascinating species of insect. "Let the show begin." For 3 days, Julian lived in the gray, artificially lit twilight of the observatory, fueled by black coffee, protein bars, and a cryogenic rage that kept him sharp and focused. He slept in 4-hour shifts on a cot in a side room, but his mind never truly rested. He watched his family not grieve, but prepare. He watched Eleanor walk through his dressing room, her movements brisk and efficient, sorting his Savile Row suits and handmade shoes into piles for donation. He saw her hold up his favorite cashmere coat, the one he wore on their first trip to Vienna, a trip she had claimed was the most romantic of her life. She looked at it for a moment, her expression unreadable, then dropped it into a black garbage bag without a second thought. It was just clutter. Later, on a call with the caterer for the wake, he heard her say, "No, not the salmon puffs. Julian hated those." "Oh, what am I saying? It doesn't matter now, does it? Let's get the caviar. Let's not be cheap." He watched Thomas in the study, his father's body not even cold, on a video call with a yacht broker. "No, not just waterfront. I want a private dock, deep enough for a 100-foot mangusta. The budget is, let's call it unlimited. My father was a very generous man." The broker offered condolences. Thomas waved them away impatiently. Yes, a tragedy. Now, about the crew quarters. He watched Isabel, sitting in her pristine white bedroom, filming a tearful black and white video for her millions of followers. "I just don't know how I'll go on," she whispered to her phone's camera, a single perfect glycerin-induced tear rolling down her cheek. "He was my rock, my everything." An hour later, he watched her in the kitchen, laughing with a friend on a FaceTime call, discussing the massive spike in her online engagement. "Tragedy is great for the algorithm," she said, popping a perfect green grape into her mouth. "My agent says we can leverage this into a book deal. Grief and glamour. It's got a ring to it, don't you think?" The most chilling conversations were between Eleanor and Marcus, who had become a permanent fixture in the house, the comforting family friend, a role he played to perfection. They spoke in low voices, in the library or the garden, believing themselves to be utterly alone, but the microphones missed nothing. The Phoenix Protocol is ready to activate, Marcus said one evening as they stood in Julian's study. Marcus had poured himself a glass of Julian's 25-year-old Pappy Van Winkle, swirling the amber liquid in the crystal glass. The moment the will clears probate and I have executive authority as the estate's executor, I trigger the sequence. It's a dead man's switch, inverted. My authorization initiates a cascade of encrypted, pre-programmed transactions, routed through a dozen shell corporations from Panama to the Seychelles. Croft Legacy Holdings will be hollowed out in less than 60 seconds. They'll be auditing a ghost. And the children? Eleanor asked, tracing the spine of a leather-bound book. They'll expect something. They'll get what's left of the domestic estate after our considerable expenses are accounted for. The house, the art, the dregs. Enough to keep them in sports cars and ski chalets for a few years. They won't look too closely. They've never had to, Marcus said with a dismissive shrug. He ran a hand over the back of her silk blouse. You, however, will be the sole beneficiary of my personal hedge fund, which is about to receive a rather significant 9-figure capital injection. The grieving widow, set for life. The day of the funeral was gray and damp, a miserable, appropriate sky. Julian sat in his command chair, watching the service on a massive central monitor, the audio piped directly into his noise-canceling headphones. He had been relegated to a spectator at his own final pageant. He saw his employees, his board members, the rivals he had respected and fought for decades. He saw genuine sadness in the faces of men and women who had only known him across a boardroom table, people who understood what had been built. His second in command, Frank Henderson, a man who started with Julian on the docks, gave a eulogy so full of raw, unvarnished grief that Julian felt an unexpected sting behind his own eyes. It was a eulogy for a man he barely remembered being. Then the camera, hidden inside a floral arrangement on the pulpit, zoomed in on the front pew. Eleanor, a portrait of tragic dignity behind a black veil, sat between Marcus and Thomas. Her back was rigid, a perfect study in her sad's grief. During Henderson's moving tribute, Julian saw her lean toward Marcus. The parabolic microphone hidden in a nearby wreath caught the whisper, clear as a bell. I feel like I'm at the theater, she murmured, her voice dripping with boredom. An exceptionally boring play. Is it almost over? My back is killing me. Marcus's hand found hers in the folds of her dress, out of sight of the pews behind them. The curtain is about to fall, my love. And then the real celebration begins. Julian felt the rage coil in his stomach, a living thing, a serpent of ice and fire. He toggled to another camera, one focused on his children. Thomas was not watching the pulpit. His phone was shielded in his lap, the screen showing the cockpit configuration of a new Gulfstream G700. Isabel was texting furiously, a small, irritated frown on her face, likely complaining about the poor reception in the church. They were not mourning a father. They were waiting for a wire transfer. The wake at the house was the final act of the farce. The rooms were filled with people drinking his best champagne and eating food prepared by a caterer he despised. Eleanor, Thomas, and Isabel moved through the crowd, their faces masks of tragic composure, accepting condolences with a solemnity that was, to Julian's all-seeing eye, utterly transparent. Julian watched, his fingers drumming a silent, rhythmic beat on the console. He tracked Marcus as he worked the room, shaking hands, offering a supportive arm to Eleanor, already assuming the role of the new man of the house, the regent. Finally, the last guest departed. David Chen was the last to leave, giving Eleanor a stiff, formal nod before the heavy front door clicked shut. His own performance as the grieving family lawyer flawless. The transformation was instantaneous, as if a switch had been flipped. Isabel ripped the black fascinator from her hair and threw it on a chair. My God, I thought that would never end. Did you see the look on Mrs. Vanderbilt's face? So pathetic. crying over a man she saw twice a year. A loud pop echoed from the dining room. Thomas emerged holding a bottle of 1996 Salon Le Menil, a champagne Julian had been saving for a market milestone. He filled 3 crystal flutes, his movements expansive and jubilant. "To Dad," Thomas said, a vicious mocking grin spreading across his face, "for providing the ultimate exit strategy." Eleanor took a glass, her movements fluid and relieved. "Don't be crass, Thomas." But she was smiling, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. "Although I admit the timing is impeccable. Any longer, and he might have started to suspect." Marcus appeared from the study, a file folder in his hand, a triumphant look in his eyes. He took the 3rd flute. "A toast," he said, raising his glass high, "to the Phoenix Protocol and to its architect." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes burning with a mixture of lust and avarice. "We did it, darling." "Finally," Eleanor breathed, her voice a low, satisfied purr. "The old fool is gone. The company, this house, all of it. It's just paperwork now." She looked at Marcus, her eyes pleading. "Take me away from here. Take me somewhere warm, somewhere we can't be found." "As you wish," Marcus said. He leaned in and kissed her, a deep proprietary kiss, right in the center of the drawing room, beneath the massive oil portrait of the man they had just buried. "Everything is in place. Once the will is read and I have control, we fly. The ashes of Julian Croft will fertilize our new life." In the observatory, Julian did not react. He simply watched the kiss, the final irrefutable confirmation. The pain was gone, burned away by the white-hot furnace of his rage. In its place was a vast, cold certainty. He picked up a secure satellite phone and dialed a number he had not used in years. It connected to a small boutique firm in a London high-rise, a firm that didn't have a nameplate on the door. "It's me," he said. "Activate the hunters. Target the Phoenix Protocol. I want it dissected. I want every shell corporation, every transfer algorithm, every password, every backdoor. And I want a trap laid inside it." He listened for a moment, his eyes still on the screen. "Yes, he thinks he's robbing a bank. I want him to find out he's been tunneling into a fortress. My fortress." The week that followed was an exercise in silent, invisible warfare. While Eleanor and Marcus met with off-market real estate brokers for private islands in the Grenadines, and Thomas test drove a Bugatti Chiron, Julian and a team of elite forensic accountants, the Hunters, worked relentlessly. The team was led by a woman named Anya Sharma, a terrifyingly brilliant Cambridge graduate with a punk haircut and a mind that saw numbers as a language. They took over a sealed wing of David Chen's firm. Julian, entering and exiting through a private garage in the dead of night, a hooded figure moving between shadows, was a phantom commander moving his pieces into place. They mapped out the Phoenix Protocol on a wall of whiteboards. It was brilliant, Julian had to admit, watching Anya deconstruct it. A digital labyrinth of breathtaking complexity. But Marcus had made one fatal, hubristic error. He was arrogant. He had reused certain encryption patterns, a signature flourish in his coding. He had left a digital fingerprint that Anya, guided by Julian's own intimate knowledge of his company's deep system architecture, could exploit. "He's using a classic braided chain, Mr. Croft," Anya explained late one night, pointing to a complex diagram of interconnected nodes. "But it's not. The encryption key is a repeating pattern based on the closing prices of stocks he shorted to impress you 5 years ago. He's proud of his cleverness. That's his vulnerability. That's how we'll undo him." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up lines of code. He built a one-way street. We're building a detour. They didn't shut it down. That would have been too simple. Instead, they built a cage around it. Working with the ex-Mossad technicians, They created a parallel system, a digital mirror world, a sandbox. Every transaction Marcus planned to siphon, every asset he planned to liquidate, would be rerouted in real time. He would see balances change on his end, receive confirmations, and watch the numbers in his offshore account swell. But it would all be a simulation. The real assets would be diverted into a new, impregnable trust, a black hole account controlled by a single biometric key. Julian's. Late one night, an alarm flashed on Anya's screen. Contact. He's running a final diagnostic. For a tense 90 seconds, they watched as Marcus's program pinged the system. A single, tiny anomaly, a data packet Anya's team had planted, flagged a potential error. Julian held his breath. On his own screen, he watched Marcus in his home office, staring at the warning. After a moment, Marcus sighed, typed a command to override the flag, and took a sip of his wine. Hubris. He couldn't imagine a system smarter than his own. The day of the will reading dawned bright and clear, a painfully beautiful day for an execution. Julian sat in a small, darkened room adjoining David's main conference room, watching a live feed on a single monitor. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, a warrior in his armor. His family arrived, radiating a barely contained avarice that was almost palpable. Eleanor in a sharp cream-colored suit, a look of victory in her eyes. Marcus at her side, his hand on the small of her back, the picture of the supportive consort. Thomas and Isabel looking bored and impatient, checking their watches. They looked like they were there to close a real estate deal. David Chen entered, his face an unreadable slate of professional gravitas. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice resonating with official gravity. "We are here to execute the final will and testament of Julian Croft. Before we proceed with the document itself, Julian left a final message. He insisted it be played for you today." Thomas rolled his eyes. Isabel sighed dramatically. Marcus gave Eleanor a subtle, reassuring squeeze of her hand. David nodded to an assistant, and the large 8K screen on the wall came to life. Julian's face, filmed weeks ago in his study, filled the screen. He looked directly into the camera, into the conference room, into their souls. "If you are watching this," his recorded voice began, deep and calm, "it means my time has come. I dedicated my life to building a legacy, a structure I believed would last for generations. I find myself wondering, in these final days, what that legacy truly is in your eyes. What you would think, what you would feel, what you would say when I was no longer there to hear it." The image on the screen suddenly switched. It was now a grainy, high-angle shot of the funeral, the audio pristine, focused on the front pew. "I feel like I'm at the theater," Eleanor's voice whispered, filling the dead silent conference room. "An exceptionally boring play. Is it almost over?" In the conference room, Eleanor's face went rigid. The color drained from her cheeks. Marcus froze, his confident smile dissolving into a mask of confusion. "The curtain is about to fall, my love," Marcus's voice answered. "And then the real celebration begins." "What is this?" Thomas stammered, his face turning blotchy and red. "What the hell is this? This is sick. This is illegal." David remained silent, his expression like granite. The screen cut again, this time to the living room of the mansion, hours after the wake. The celebratory pop of the champagne cork echoed in the conference room, a sound of damnation. They watched in abject horror as their own ghosts toasted Julian's death. "To Dad," came Thomas's sneering voice, magnified and damning, "for providing the ultimate exit strategy." The screen cut to Isabel in her bedroom, talking to her agent. "Tragedy is great for the algorithm. We can leverage this. grief and glamour. Then, the final damning scene. Eleanor and Marcus standing beneath his portrait. Finally. Her voice purred from the screen, a sound of pure, venomous satisfaction. The old fool is gone. Take me somewhere warm, somewhere we can't be found. The video showed Marcus kissing her, long and triumphant. In the conference room, Eleanor stared at the screen, her mouth agape, her skin the color of parchment. She looked as though she was seeing a specter, a nightmare made real. As the kiss held on screen, a moment of obscene triumph frozen in time, the heavy soundproofed conference room door swung silently open. Julian Croft walked in. He was not a ghost. He was solid, real, radiating an aura of cold, concentrated power. He looked rested, vital, and more dangerous than any of them had ever seen him. The air in the room seemed to crystallize, to become unbreathable. Thomas made a choked, gagging sound, stumbling back in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. Isabel shrank into herself, covering her face with her hands, a low moan escaping her lips. Marcus Thorne turned a shade of gray Julian had never seen on a living human. His body locked in a state of pure, catatonic terror. Eleanor simply stared, her mind shattered, her eyes wide with the primal terror of a blasphemer seeing her God rise from the grave to pass judgment. Julian walked to the head of the table and stood beside David. He did not look at them with hatred. He looked at them like a biologist examining specimens under a microscope, specimens that had failed to evolve. "As you can see," he said, his voice calm and resonant, each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into a deep well. "Reports of my death were, in fact, an exaggeration. Our family, however, is deceased." He paused, letting the finality of the statement settle like a shroud over the room. "Eleanor," he said, his gaze pinning her to her chair. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You want it to be more than a decoration. You will now be a cautionary tale. David will be serving you with divorce papers this afternoon. The infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement, which you signed so eagerly, is ironclad and absolute. You will leave my house by sundown with a single suitcase containing only the clothes you brought into this marriage. You will receive nothing, not a dollar, not a memory, not a crumb." He then turned his cold eyes on Marcus, who was visibly shaking, a fine tremor running through his entire body. "Mr. Thorne, you named your plan after a mythical bird rising from the ashes, a poetic choice. But the thing about myths, Marcus, is that they aren't real. Your Phoenix Protocol was a work of art. My people were very impressed. So impressed, in fact, that for the past 72 hours, they have been watching you perform inside a digital theater of their own design. Every dollar you thought you were cleverly hiding, every asset you tried to transfer, has been rerouted into a new trust. My trust. 30 minutes ago, you initiated the final sequence. You received confirmation that $950 million was transferred to your holding company in Grand Cayman. That confirmation was a fiction. The real money is secure. As we speak, a team is securing your office. The authorities are waiting in the lobby to discuss your unique interpretation of fiduciary duty, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder, given your arrangement with Dr. Finch, who has provided a full confession. Your flight to the Caribbean is canceled. Permanently. Finally, he looked at his children, two strangers who wore his DNA as a costume. "Thomas, Isabel, you were born at the finish line and believed you had won the race. The race begins now. As of this moment, you are disinherited. The trust funds are dissolved. The credit lines are severed. The apartments, the cars, the allowances, all of it is gone. I have given you every advantage, and you have produced nothing but contempt. You are adults now. I trust you'll find your own way in the world. You are, after all, free of the old fool. He picked up a thick bound document from the table. This is my new will, my new legacy, my entire fortune, every share of stock, every piece of property, every dollar in every account will be placed into a single charitable foundation. He let his gaze sweep over their destroyed, vacant faces one last time. It will be called the Croft Foundation. It will provide scholarships and startup capital for underprivileged students and entrepreneurs from the Baltimore shipyards, children who have nothing but want to build everything, children like I was. They are more worthy of the Croft legacy than you ever were. He placed the document down. His work was done. He had faced the coup and crushed it utterly. He had allowed them to build their Tower of Babel to reach for heaven, and he had brought it crashing down upon their heads, burying them in the rubble of their own greed. Without another look at the ruins of his family, Julian Croft turned and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, a sound as final and absolute as a guillotine's fall. He walked through the marble lobby, past the two waiting detectives who tipped their heads in a gesture of respect, and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. He was not a ghost. He was a man resurrected, a man reborn in ice and fire, leaving the dead to bury their dead. The empire was his. The legacy was his. And he was, for the first time in a very long time, utterly and completely alone and free. He didn't return to the empty mansion or the cold sterility of the observatory. Instead, he took a car to the heliport. An hour later, he was airborne, the helicopter banking not towards some distant paradise, but east, toward the forgotten coast of his youth. Below him, the pristine towers of Manhattan gave way to the sprawling, gritty industrial heartland of New Jersey. And then, finally, to the familiar, rust-colored cranes and gantries of the Baltimore docks. This was where his real life had begun, not with a silver spoon, but with grease-stained hands and a hunger that could not be sated. This was where his legacy would be reborn, not in a name on a museum wall, but in the foundations of new enterprises, in the futures of those who, like him, were determined to build something that would last.